Another story that we're following for you today. Hundreds of people gathered on Parliament Hill today to rally support to end the ongoing conflict in Darfur that has killed over 200,000 people and left thousands homeless. Liberal MP Borys Wrzesnewskyj took part in the rally and joins us now with more on the story. So, Borys Wrzesnewskyj, sadly, I think a lot of people are familiar with the plight of people in Darfur, perhaps less familiar with the UN declaration, the responsibility to protect. And I know that one of the reasons for the rally on the Hill was to support this. Tell me more about responsibility to protect. What exactly is this?
In a lot of ways, that was a Canadian initiative, and 2 years ago I had the historic opportunity to take part in the Canadian delegation at the World Summit at the UN when the UN Assembly accepted the R2P principle. Days after, many editorialists were somewhat pessimistic if that would actually translate into something concrete, but at that point in time there was a feeling of euphoria that just maybe it would translate into a force of action, that in fact this was the beginning of a new era when we say that never again truly is never again.
And at the heart of this declaration is a justification for international intervention in the face of any concerns about sovereignty, right? If there are atrocities being committed in a certain country, you can circumvent whatever claims there are to sovereignty and say, no, we must help those people being victimized in that country, correct?
Exactly, and especially when we talk about situations of genocide, and that's in fact what has taken place in Darfur and Sudan. Initially we had a hurricane of hatred that was taking place. Approximately 200,000 people were killed, and in a lot of ways, and it's horrible to put it this way, when the bullets ran out, there was an attempt at genocide by attrition. And we have a stalemate that's taken place over the last 2 years, and the international community has not stepped forward forcefully enough. The Sudanese government has tried to take advantage of this stalemate, but we're hopeful that that will end this fall with the new African Union and United Nations mission.
So again, when you talk about the kind of euphoria or at least hope after the UN did sign on to the declaration, the responsibility to protect, why wasn't that somehow enforced? Why didn't the spirit of that declaration produce any more meaningful results and more effective intervention in Sudan?
The declaration was made. Unfortunately, a lot of the details about, well, how do we then go about acting? At what point are things triggered that we act? What bodies do we use? And there are various forms of genocide. And I referenced this hurricane of hatred where a tribe descends on another tribe. We've seen that often in Africa in this last decade. That requires a different type of action, immediate action. Genocide by attrition, what's going on in Darfur at the present time, requires different sorts of action. And unfortunately, we made this declaration, but we haven't followed through in clearly specifying what the processes will be. And every circumstance is somewhat different.
We know, of course, that I believe at the end of this week, the UN again is looking at the mandate of a peacekeeping mission, peacekeeping troops going into the Sudan. So what has to happen there, in your view, to make sure that any deployment of a peacekeeping contingent will be effective?
Well, over the last 2 years, too many people have continued to die. And the African Union mission, which in a lot of ways was empowered by a Canadian contribution of approximately 200 million, produced a bit of a stalemate. When I flew in, the week after that UN resolution, I flew into Darfur, into a place called El Fasher. And there was an internal displaced refugee camp with over 100,000 people there. And when you walked in, you were overwhelmed with the numbers of children and women, the most vulnerable in society. And every child, the smiling faces were like small gifts from God. Yet within 2 kilometers of the perimeter of that camp, notwithstanding an AMIS African Union peacekeeping force, just outside of that camp, within 2 kilometers, atrocities were continuing. That day when I arrived, 8 villages were absolutely destroyed, wiped off the face of the earth. And what was fascinating, in the aftermath, when those villages were visited, we found identification cards of Sudanese army and Janjaweed, the so-called independent militias, identification cards which were issued by the Sudanese government. So this is actually an atrocity and a genocide that has been orchestrated by the Khartoum government, by President al-Bashir. And there are a number of consequences that should result from to the leaders in a regime that perpetuate genocides.
Well, you're right. It's such a troubling situation, and we'll certainly watch developments and hope that there is a happier conclusion in the not-too-distant future. Borys Wrzesnewskyj, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
That concludes this edition of CBC News Today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nancy Wilson. In a moment